hopefully. We had almost 200 registered, so that was exciting for us. Okay, well, I think we will go ahead and get started in the interest of time. So again, I want to welcome everybody. I'm Lee Williams. I am the co-founder and community relations director at Towards Zero Waste. Our vision at Towards Zero Waste is to see a North Carolina where individuals, families, businesses, and local governments are mindful of the waste they create and take active steps to drastically minimize landfill contributions. For time purposes, the version of Kiss the Ground you will see tonight is a shortened educational version that will take 45 minutes. We want to encourage you to use the chat to ask questions that you think of during the film. There's a lot of information even in this short version of the film, so you may want to grab a pencil and paper and take notes. A little bit of housekeeping. We're having some high winds here in Cary tonight. So if the power should go out or blip, we'll get back on just as soon as possible. Go ahead and log back in. Hopefully we'll be running again. Also, just an FYI that while we are recording, only speakers show up in the recording. So no need to worry if you don't care to be filmed. And unless you're speaking, you will not be on camera on the recording. We do want to give a really special thanks and a shout out to the town of Cary and the Cary Theater for helping sponsor tonight's event. We do hope we'll be able to hold these kinds of events in the Cary Theater and at other theaters across the state when we can safely gather again. We also want to thank from across the state, city and town council members who may have joined us, town staffs, county representatives, and state representatives, anybody joining us tonight. A lot of what the film presents is not information most of us were taught and will be important considerations when making decisions that impact the community and the greater good. So we are so grateful for their interest in this subject. We would also like to thank all the volunteers that helped with tonight's event and all of our volunteers here at Towards Zero Waste. We are a volunteer-driven organization and we could not continue our mission without those volunteers. If you're interested in working with us, please go to our website and fill out the form under the volunteer tab. And with that, I'm going to invite Michael to start the film. Everybody sit back, relax, and use the chat for comments and questions, and we will see you in 45 minutes. All right. That was great. I've seen that movie now several times, and it still brings a tear right there at the end. Okay, thanks everyone. we've had a few more folks joining, and we're going to have a few folks joining late who had already seen the feature-length version of the film, which I do recommend also watching. It's got a little bit more information in it. I'm going to go ahead and make our panelists introductions. I'm really excited about our panel tonight. I believe we could have done a whole hour with each of these incredible people, so I hope you'll have time after to get to know them and their work a little bit better. First up, we have Steve and Elke McCalla, who own Rocky Ridge Farm, a 30-acre certified naturally grown organic fruit, nut, and vegetable farm in Louisburg, North Carolina. In addition to practicing regenerative agriculture using crop rotation and low-till, Steve and Elke also have a geothermal greenhouse, a recycled cooking oil program, make and utilize biochar, and offer agritourism for their local community. They partner with the Rural Advancement Foundation International through Rafi's Farmers of Color Network and Farm to Church program. Welcome, Steve and Elke.
Thank you.
Next we have Kat Nigro. She is the VP of Experience at CompostNow, a local food waste collection service which empowers community members and businesses to compost. She's been involved in the composting community movement for the past 5 years, first as the general manager of Tilthy Rich Compost, which was a Durham bike-powered compost service, and now growing the compost movement with CompostNow. She's passionate about healthy soil, community building, and environmental justice.
Hi, y'all.
Welcome, Kat. Then we have Dr. Arnab Bhowmik. Dr. Bhowmik is a faculty of soil science and soil microbiology in the Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Design at North Carolina A&T State University in Greensboro, North Carolina. His teaching and research program focus on soil health improvement and greenhouse gas mitigation. His lab investigates the role of climate adaptive management practices like reduced tillage, manure and compost application, cover cropping, and crop rotations on soil microorganisms and their functions. Welcome, Dr. Bhowmik.
Thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for being here, and especially my department chair and my lab mates, my students. Thank you very much for your support.
Welcome to all of them too. I saw them in the chat. And lastly, we have Eric Mathis. He is the co-founder of Miracle Grounds Farm and Network in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and director at the Institute for Regenerative Design and Innovation. Eric's 15-plus year career in applied sustainability includes being part of the core team that launched the hemp industry across the U.S. through the 2014 Farm Bill. He also played an important role in linking coal-dependent communities to the Green Jobs movement in collaboration with former White House Special Advisor for Green Jobs, Van Jones. Eric also co-designed an award-winning coal transition model called Sustainable Williamson. His most recent work is being co-developed in collaboration with the Center for Trauma Resilient Communities in Winston-Salem, and it's poised to become a national model in mid-2021. So welcome to everybody. I am going to go ahead and get started, and I encourage everybody to put any questions that you have in the chat. I'm going to go ahead and get started with some questions that we have and start with Dr. Bhowmik. Dr. Bhowmik, when discussing climate change, why is it crucially important to address carbon drawdown, land regeneration, and ecosystem function?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think the movie kind of talks about it a bit. That only reducing the greenhouse gases might not be enough. We need to draw down the carbon that's already there, and one of the best ways to do that, I should say affordable ways to do that, is to grow plants. One of the things I would like to point out, which the movie kind of does not talk in details, is about the other greenhouse gases. So we have methane and nitrous oxide, which are the other two greenhouse gases coming out from the agriculture sector. And I think those are also equally, if not more, important as compared to carbon dioxide. The reason is because their global warming potential, or the amount of heat that they trap is higher. So for example, nitrous oxide traps 300 times more heat than carbon dioxide. Methane traps around 24 times more heat than carbon dioxide. So there is a way to draw down carbon dioxide by growing plants, but there is no way of drawing down nitrous oxide. One molecule of nitrous oxide lost is lost. So, and I saw some of the chats regarding animal agriculture involving animals. So I think that's very important to consider, the trade-offs, because you have huge amount of methane emissions, for example. But again, there are technologies to reduce that, both at the animal, husbandry level and at the farm level. You have nitrous oxide emissions, from different types of management practices. So I think it's important to consider the trade-offs, but generally speaking, the highest amount of greenhouse gas in the atmosphere is carbon dioxide. So growing plants, having cover crops, making sure that you have the plants to feed the soil. Okay, so I'm using this. It's a different thing that we're used to, right? We're used to thinking the soil feeds the plant, but it's a relation where the plant also feeds the soil. So that is very important.
And just to chime in really quick, if I may, also the number one greenhouse gas that never shows up on most folks' radars is water vapor. and one of the guys that was presenting, Alan Savory, is doing some of the most advanced work in that arena. So as they're rebuilding those soils around desertified land globally, as some of these areas close canopy, it slows down that the water vaporization rate to where it restores and starts sequestering a lot of the H2O and aquifers that are otherwise dried out. So that's another greenhouse gas that a lot of people aren't considering when thinking about climate change. So just putting that out there.
Yeah, I think that connects to another one of our questions, which is, can someone speak a little bit about how soil affects the water cycle?
I'd love to chime in, but I don't want to want to step back and respect anybody else's insights too.
I can go ahead if.
Sure.
Okay. So, well, there's so much relation between soil and water, and I'm just thinking, where to start from. But I'll stick to, what kind of the
We're
movie.
pretty low level, we're pretty low level, so keep it kind of simple.
Okay, so I mean, you have the rains, you have precipitation, so water acts as a reservoir for the water, for basically any kind of water that it receives. And then you have the infiltration process where, some of the water is held by the soil and the remaining goes into the groundwater. So it recharges the groundwater, right? And soil acts as a filter. The thing which I think is important to realize is we need to have more of transpiration rather than evaporation from the bare land. And that is very important because a covered soil acts as a mulch, meaning, it definitely protects you from, the extremes of temperatures, but also it conserves moisture in the soil, which is very important for the plants to grow and for the microbes to survive. And then, the film talks about the inland water cycles, the smaller water cycles, which contributes to 40%, of the total global water cycle, which is important because, which means that where we'll have rain and what is the intensity of those rainfall events is going to depend how much cover we have in the soil. So I think that's kind of the linkage.
I think that's fascinating. It's something I don't think I ever thought about before watching the film, that the small water cycle was that dependent on the water content of the soil. Awesome. Okay, I'm going to move over to Steve and Elke. I learned about your farm through RAFI, the Royal Advancement Foundation International's Farmers of Color Network, which was started in 2017 to support farmers of color and grow their numbers. Can you tell us, why is something like that necessary?
Yeah, what this comes down to is, in the past, there were a great number of acres of land that were owned by people of color. And I'll go back to, say, 1911, 1912, there were some 15 million acres that were being farmed by people of color. Now, there has been a dwindling of that land ownership down to far less than 1 million acres as of, say, 2020. So you might ask yourself, how did this come to be? And largely it came due to pretty much unfair practices with regard to loans and the purchases of more efficient farm equipment. So it would be a disadvantage there. Not every year is going to be a good year on the farm. So those are the years that you would be dependent on your own personal resources or perhaps loans from government agencies. So in the past, people of color were denied those loans, and it almost made farming a very, very, very difficult thing to do in the drier years. So what Rafi is trying to do is to regenerate interest in farming for people of color. And also they have a nice grant program so that if you wish to start farming, it can pretty much get you set up on the table with a knife and fork and plates without having to start from scratch, which is very difficult because it's going to take quite a bit of financial input in order to really get a farm started, to get it growing, and to even rejuvenate the land. So that is why I believe this is totally necessary.
Gotcha. Awesome. So while we're on that subject, can you tell us a little bit about some of the innovation you've been able to create through your partnering with Rafi? I understand you have a pretty cool greenhouse.
Yeah. Yes. So we got a Rafi grant. And when we applied for the grant, we were trying to figure out, well, what could we do that would essentially lift us up and put us on the map? And I saw a farmer on the internet, and he was in Nebraska. And I think his last name was Finch. And what he was doing was taking the heat that exists in the ground and using it to supplant the heat in his greenhouse in a relatively inexpensive manner. And that was a geo-air greenhouse.
And he was growing oranges in Nebraska in the winter
Wow.
Yes,
with this system.
exactly. So when the temperatures outside went down to below freezing, he was still able to grow oranges in his greenhouse. So this caught my attention. I said, well, I'm in sunny North Carolina. So really our winters really aren't as cold as say Nebraska or like Minnesota or Wyoming. But here we still get nights where things can freeze. And then this would cause us to have to either have burned kerosene or to use CP&L, Duke Power, or somebody to keep this greenhouse warm. So what we did was we dug a hole 8 feet deep, 15 feet wide, and 45 feet long. And we went down into the ground 8 feet. So 8 feet was the depth. Now at 6 foot and 8 foot, we put culvert pipes and non-perforated culvert pipe, which was attached back up through the ground into the greenhouse. At the other end of that pipe, we had a blower. And what we did was we were blowing air from under the ground, which was then passed through I should say, it started in the top of the greenhouse, went underground, came out through the blower back into the greenhouse. So in the wintertime, I'm taking air that's perhaps, 25 degrees or 20 degrees. And after passing it through the tubules that are underneath the ground, I'm picking up some of that 68-degree ground temperature, and the temperature of the air coming back into the greenhouse is 55, 57 degrees. That's enough to keep all of my seedlings from freezing, and that's enough possibly to keep tomato plants alive and peppers alive in the greenhouse to be set out in the spring. And I didn't have to pay Duke Power anything except for one small blower.
We had ripe tomatoes in February.
Exactly.
Ripe tomatoes in February.
Very cool. Very cool. All right. So I'm going to move to Kat. Kat, the film states that composting is about community. What does that statement mean to you?
That's a beautiful question. And I want to point out that it mentioned the concept of composting in community when my friend, Michael Martinez from LA Compost was on screen. So I definitely want to give him a shout out. Very talented, doing a lot of great work in LA. But to me, when I think of composting, I immediately think of community care because it rebuilds our soils. And just like we learned, soil is a part of our humanity. We're tied to it in so many different ways. So I don't think I need to go into how important healthy soil is for, healthy, nutrient-rich plants, which is important for healthy people and resilient local food systems. I'll save that for another time. But I do want to touch on 2 points that I don't think people think of when they think of how composting builds more resilient, healthier communities. And the first is how it fights environmental injustice. And I'm going to use Durham as a quick example. I don't know if y'all know this, but Durham closed its landfill a long time ago. And we ship our trash an hour and 30 minutes, an hour and 40 minutes away to Sampson County, right? One way, all the way to Sampson County. Guess who lives in Sampson County? Lower income community members. And they're the ones that are fronting the cost of living near a landfill, which has known to create adverse health effects. So I do want to say, when you're composting, you're also helping to fight that injustice that I feel like a lot of people turn their eye to, right? Even the concept throw away. Well, there's no such thing as a way. Somebody is having to deal with those consequences of your choices. So I just wanted to say that. And then third, this one's a little more geeky, but it helps our economy. It helps give jobs to local community members. There's a study that says that composting creates twice as many jobs as landfilling and 4 times as many jobs as incinerators. So again, composting and healthy soil touches so much of our humanity. Yeah, I'll leave it with that.
That's awesome. Great. Eric, how can we build the value of regenerative food into our community fabric? What kinds of models can we put into action to help build community and the demand for regenerative food?
Great question. Thanks. I'll give 2 examples. One example is my work when I was in West Virginia, and we were basically connecting community gardens to decreasing health disparities within communities, and connecting the community garden supply chain to a local federally qualified health center for promoting like a food prescription program, and connecting it to a broader network of local restaurants, and training the chefs that were not only able to then diversify an otherwise very unhealthy menu and include options that were suggested by doctors and everything like that, to where patients that had diabetes would go into these restaurants, crack open their menu, and actually know what to order. And what they were ordering was actually having an impact on local sustainable agriculture and soil development, as well as decreasing the overall health disparities within the community. So what we learned from that in Williamson, we're now replicating in Winston-Salem, and what we call the story of the plate. So right now, we're connecting a lot of the pieces that a lot of the panelists are talking about, all the way from the science of biosequestration of soil to racial justice to general social justice. So I'd like to walk you through a really quick supply chain. If you were to visit one of the restaurants here in Winston-Salem that we're getting ready to replicate across North Carolina and the US. I can talk about that later. This year, a lot of the customers that would go into, for example, Mazelle's restaurant in downtown Winston, will soon have a QR code. And the waiter comes in and basically talks about the story of the plate. They're prompted to scan that and then go through a transparent regenerative supply chain, all the way from where the food waste left the restaurant, where that food waste landed in some low-income communities where we're training entrepreneurs, food-based entrepreneurs, predominantly Black and brown entrepreneurs, for producing food, as well as growing food that returns back into those restaurants. And we're also connecting one other final component around that connects to trauma resiliency, as a lot of the chefs that are now cooking food in some of these restaurants are making those connections. So we're training a lot of the chefs that are entering these restaurants to have the sophisticated know-how on how to identify the farmers that are building the right kind of soil that will be producing the food that has better flavor as well as has a positive impact on the city. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah, that's fascinating. That was more than I expected. Very cool. Okay, Dr. Bhowmik, how does, let's see, can you explain how our chemical fertilizers mask the problems of degraded soils?
Yeah, that's a very important question. I think with chemical fertilizers, you can forget the fact that you have a living system out there. You just feed the plants. You can apply excessive fertilizers, excessive chemicals, and still get a good yield. So if you're not really understanding what's happening in the soil and the sustainability aspect of it, or where those excess fertilizers are ending up, those chemicals in the air, in the water, and definitely in the soil and sometimes in your food. So I mean that's a huge problem, and one of the things I think which this film kind of indicates to is we need to feed the soil so that it can feed the plants rather than directly feeding the plants.
Gotcha. Right. Awesome. Okay, back to Steve and Elke. Your farm is certified naturally grown. Can you tell us a bit about what that means?
Certified Naturally Grown is an organization that recognizes that small farms like mine and Steve's, where it's a 2-person operation, and the USDA organic certification is pretty much out of our reach, because the time, money, labor, paperwork to achieve and maintain that certification is beyond what we're able to sustain. And so they're more of a grassroots organization to bring that same quality of the USDA certified organic standard to small farmers, but in a format that's doable and sustainable for us.
Gotcha. Very cool. All right, we have a question from the chat. It's from Gregory. He asks, haven't some attempts at de-desertification run into problems over time, like salination of the soil resulting following many years of irrigation? I'm not sure I'm saying that question exactly right, but does anyone have information about that? Do you want me to ask it again? It's asking.
Yeah, what was the, sorry.
So if some attempts at de-desertification have run into problems over time, like salination of the soil, and then it says resulting following many years of irrigation.
I'd have a lot of follow-up questions in terms of clarification for the person,
Okay.
because for me, it has something to do with the irrigation. The only time that, as I understand it, in Savory's application, most of them have been successful. Salinization, from my understanding, has only occurred. So when you irrigate, that aquifer begins drawing from a nearby highly salinated water source. So if it's near a sea or something like that, it's similar to what happened in during the Sumerian Empire, as they started overgrazing a lot of the food. That's what caused the growth of deserts there. As they were overgrazing and overwatering the food, the water had to be drawn in from the local seas, if that's what I understand the question being.
Gotcha.
And they would be correct.
I can add to that quickly to what Eric mentioned. Yeah, I think the quality of irrigation water is very important. If you have a lot of salts in it, that will end up in your soil and could cause salinization. I think the second thing is if you over fertilize, fertilizers are nothing but salts. That could also lead to salinization. So it's important to maintain that balance.
Gotcha. Okay. And if Gregory wants to put any follow-up question to that, if I didn't ask it correctly, feel free to do that in the chat. Let's see. I think I want to go back to Kat. So quickly, can you tell us, a lot of people have never heard of a compost pickup service. Can you tell us how that works?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess I'll just start with a disclaimer of we are not, of course, the only way to compost, nor we're the best for your situation. We're just one way to compost. It's going to take backyard composters, vermicomposters, drop-off, municipality composting. It's going to take it all to solve this problem of food waste and depleted soils. So just want to start by saying that. I don't want this to sound like an ad, but I will talk more about kind of the concept of community composters, which is what a service like ours, CompostNow, is. Basically what we do is we're haulers, or like what I like to say is we're community connectors. So we're connecting the people who are creating compostables with the people who are processing it, and then connecting that compost with the people who are going to use it to grow healthy food. So we're the connectors. Basically, we try to make composting as easy as possible. When we were developing this business model, this service model, really, we were thinking of what are the biggest pain points of composting? Because I don't know about y'all, maybe I'm an optimist, but I think people want to do good. They just need some direction and they need an easy way to do it. And so we wanted to create something that was so easy, anybody could do it. So we knew that we had to address the three biggest pain points in composting from what we saw, which was people don't think it's easy. People don't think it's very convenient because you need time, space, labor, and people think it smells. And I always like to say, if it smells, you're doing it wrong. But regardless, with our service, what we do is, our members, and we can service, universities, households, apartments, whoever needs composting, we got you. And what we do is we basically pick up their compostables on a schedule, and then we actually connect it with our partner, Brooks Contractor, which is in Goldston. They're an amazing family-owned facility. They turn it into compost, and then we give it back to our members or local garden and urban farms, depending on where our members want to send it. So I do want to say, composting is really important because it addresses, it helps avoid those emissions, those methane emissions from the landfill. But we don't want to make compost for the sake of it. We must get it into our soils. And so if we didn't fulfill that second part of the loop, we wouldn't be doing our jobs correctly. So I do want to emphasize that when people think of our service, they think at the front end of, well, they're going to pick up my bin every week. But I really want to emphasize how important that second piece is, where it's out of your mind, but we're getting it back into the soil. And that's what's most important. So I hope that clarified kind of what community composting is. But there's hundreds of services across the country that are trying to help people compost.
Absolutely. I'm a CompostNow customer, and I compost in my backyard, and I do drop off. I do it all. But I want to make sure we highlight what Kat said about that end piece, that we need to be using the compost. And there's so many places to use it. Our municipalities can be using it on playing fields, in parks, on sides of roads. We need to encourage them to take this asset that we have and utilize it to build our soils and to prevent some of the runoff issues. And all, there's just a wide array of issues that composting solves if we close that loop. Okay, so we've learned a lot about, there was a question in the chat about the animal livestock, and it was kind of answered. It was from Amanda, but we want to dig a little more into that. So let's see, the film discusses regenerative grazing as a major piece of the puzzle for repairing our soils. We know that the majority of meat raised in the US is not raised regeneratively. It is carbon intense and unsustainable and unethical. The film states that if you are going to eat meat, it is imperative that you ensure that meat is raised regeneratively. Can anyone speak to the role of animal agriculture in soil health? And additionally, how can our viewers find regeneratively raised meat and vegetables? Was that a mouthful? That's for anybody who wants to take it.
It's a well-stated question. Just as far as our work in Winston-Salem and what we're working on across the state and nationally is, unfortunately, there isn't any real guarantee of understanding where your food production, if the regenerative practices are actually being followed. I really like the certified naturally grown one. It's bottom up, but two, it addresses a lot of the shortcomings that corporations have basically decreased the overall impact or the intended impact of organic farming in the beginning with organic certification. And now it's become this, just kind of pay to play club. So my suggestion to folks is it takes a lot of digging, but that particular certification that was mentioned earlier, there are some certifications that are coming down the pipeline through Rodell Institute that they're releasing this year and next year in development. And we're developing one here in Winston-Salem that hopefully will be coming to a city near you, to where you would have like a interactive, it's not an app, but be able to actually interact with via video of like the farmers saying who they are, going in and talking about what they do with their soil and some of the innovative approaches like that. But unfortunately, there's not a lot of ways for the consumers to assess at this point in time that I know of. Maybe one of the other panelists knows of one.
I would say, like, I'd like to say know your farmer, and just going to your local farmers market and, talking to the meat farmers there. Most small farmers don't have these large scale, beef farms, and they're, tearing up the land and all. They're small scale, and so they do things more sensibly, more reliably, and ask them, what are their grazing methods, or what are their you know regenerative practices that they're using. And I think you'll be surprised and really enjoy making that connection and understanding where that food comes from. But just finding local meat farmers, like at farmers markets. I'm not sure where else to go, aside from Google searches, but meeting the farmer and asking them what their practices are. The small farmers aren't going to have these, the big houses where you got 800 chickens in them and stuff. Most of the farmers around here we know of, their chickens running on the grass, they're pastured. There's pastured beef everywhere around here. So I think just check your local farmers market to start would be a great place.
Yeah, and I would like to add, I think it's a great point, and we as consumers, we need to realize that there's a cost associated with labeling it as sustainable, and we should be ready to pay that premium price, if we want to support, let's say, net zero concept. So that's a very important role for us to play to support these.
Absolutely. And I would add that if you're going to eat meat, we all need to be eating less. It's probably best not to be eating it, but if you're going to eat it, make sure it's regenerative. And it costs a little more. So naturally, you'll eat less. So buy regenerative, eat a little less. On to the next question. So Ray Archuleta, who was in the film, he's the conservation agronomist featured in the film, who we just learned in the chat from Dr. Bhowmik actually worked for 20 years at the NRCS Center in Greensboro. He lamented that our producers don't know how the soil works, and that he, even after college education in soil science, did not know. I would add that our land planners, groundskeepers, landscapers also don't understand how the soil works, nor did I about 4 years ago until I dug a little bit. How can we change this?
I'll jump in again. One, we can move away from the standard agricultural formula for just focusing on increasing yield and production. So we've been chipping away with the North Carolina Ag Extension and Agricultural Office for about 3 years, and moving the needle towards providing a full profile for soil analysis for the farmers, so they can actually understand the robust characteristics that are required for building living soil. Right now, the only data they get back is engineered for those farmers consuming the very products that this film was very rightfully saying that we shouldn't be consuming. So for me, that's the navigational tool for the large scale farmers that we work with, to be able to, like, you know, see the benefits of cover cropping and all that. That's just one suggestion. So
I can talk a bit about the capacity that we have as a land grant university. So we have this tripartite mission of teaching, research, and extension. So we want to make sure we convey and train our students who are the next generation, right? Conduct research, engage them in real life problems, and then the extension part is also very important, where we are actually taking that knowledge from the researchers and going to the small scale farmers, or different kinds of growers that we cater to. So I think we need a lot of different approaches to address this problem.
All right, well, and we're starting with us. Okay, I want to go back to Steve and Elke for a minute. They've got something interesting going on in their farm. It's not talked about in the film, but another innovative regenerative agricultural practice you use is biochar. And unless our audience has read Drawdown, they probably don't know what biochar is. Could you tell us a little bit about it?
Why, certainly. This is a full drawdown, because we're actually putting pure carbon back into the soil. So you would say to yourself, well, in terms of the exudates that might come from roots, or perhaps decaying roots, or leaves that are falling onto the ground, or perhaps plants that were trampled by the cattle, that's one methodology of getting the carbon back into the soil. Well, this methodology is a little bit different, because what we're doing is we're burning wood and reducing it to carbon by using something called a retort. So inside the retort, you can think of it as being a bottle or a container in which there is a reduced oxygen atmosphere. And by heating wood in this low oxygen atmosphere, it will then create those vapors which would then tend to escape from that container under pressure. By drilling holes in the bottom of this container, those gases, or those volatile gases, would come out the bottom of your container and directly into the fire that is actually heating the container. And as a result, all of the volatiles are burnt off. And after maybe about, say, 3 or 4 hours of burning, what you're left with is a container that has maybe about, say, 2/3 of the original volume that it had, but it is pure carbon and very little ash. Now, we will take that and grind it up and then sprinkle it onto the soil and try and mix the top 4 inches of the soil with perhaps a 5% concentration by weight of the carbon. So you say, how does this work? Well, the carbon actually has nanotubes in it, and it also has the residual tubules from the xylem and the phloem of the plants that you perhaps have burned, branches, twigs, logs, etc. These tubules have a tendency to absorb moisture and nutrients from the soil. Or I can take compost and put it directly on this carbon and let it sit under a tarp, maybe for about 2 or 3 weeks, and now the carbon has become impregnated with these nutrients that are from the biological breakdown of manures. So now when I put this in the soil,
Yep.
The plants have,
We treated the poorest soil on our farm, which
Yes.
is pretty much clay, packed so hard it's like a brick. We put the biochar down, and right now that area is growing the best char we've ever seen, and it grows faster and more fresh and luscious. It's
Wow.
incredible. It amends sandy soil as well as it amends the clay soil. It holds water, nutrients. It creates what I call a condominium for the microbes because it provides them everything they need. They have food, they have water, and they just multiply and explode. It becomes a big city of these microorganisms because they're so happy. And the need for fertilization is reduced because the biochar retains that fertilization. Once you put it in the soil, you don't have to keep putting it back in every year. It lasts in the soil for hundreds of years. And I don't know, those are just a few of the extra benefits that I could think of off the top of my head, but there's so many more.
Very cool. So if we wanted to get some biochar, I mean, I happen to have had it spread on my yard by my regenerative landscape company. How would somebody go about finding biochar?
well, you probably have, you can look it up on the web, and there are companies that actually make biochar. I know there's a fellow out in Asheville, his name is Pat Battle, and he's making biochar in mass. And there's another gentleman up in New England who's doing the same thing, and he's actually working in tandem with Pat Battle to make the biochar, so it can be purchased online.
Okay, so we can't come to your farm and get some then.
Well, on a good day, you could.
Good to know. All right, let's see. Let's go over to Eric. Eric, let's talk a little bit about the relationship between human health, soil health, and planetary health, and maybe toss in some soil biome and gut biome if you can handle that as well.
Yeah, those are some of the connections that we're attempting to make here in Winston-Salem. So revisiting my response earlier, my past work in coal country was basically connecting a lot of people that were unhealthy, getting healthy food into their guts. And we were kind of on the cutting edge of what's called social determinants of health. And we were able to see a lot of measurable outcomes from that. But I really hadn't made any connections to soil, although we were using biochar up on mountaintop removal sites, and it works there beautifully well. And that's like a moonscape almost. But when I came down to Winston-Salem and started working at Cross North Children's Home and their associated organization, Center for Trauma Resilient Communities, everything really blossomed from there, from the gut as it's related to our neurophysiology, since a lot of my past work is with low-income communities. I was really, really interested myself, having suffered from some past trauma as well, on what could address systemically some of the issues that I was running into in low-income communities, in terms of a lot of what I see from populations that are coming out of prisons, like fight or flight or anything like that. So what we're connecting in Winston-Salem is compost. I'll talk about that, and then bionutrient food, and that should answer your question. But what we're doing with compost in the aforementioned story that played earlier is we also integrate it into the school curriculum. So some of the kids come out to our farm, they're eating an apple, they throw it in a compost pile. Then we gather some of that compost and mix it with some of our soil plant starters. We had about 150 fifth graders come out to our farm last year. They put their hands in the soil and they're learning about how the microbes actually stimulate serotonin, not only making you happy, but also addressing some of the issues around trauma resiliency. And then they go throughout the entire supply chain and they're growing the food and they're understanding how to grow bionutrient food, which is kind of beyond organic or regenerative agriculture. and learning how the superfood really quick. If any of the listeners were eating an organic carrot versus a bionutrient carrot that we grow on our farm, they would literally have to eat 100 or more of those carrots equal to one of the carrots that we grow using bionutrient certification. Well, we're working on the certification, but in consuming that, it does all kinds of things in terms of your gut health, your neurophysiology, as well as augmenting a lot of the effects related to getting your hands in the soil with those microbes. And the final component, and kind of building off of the Rodale Institute's recent report this year, and I wrote a really brief article in Biocycle magazine that kind of connects all these dots too, if any of your listeners want to check it out. But it used that report as a springboard on how connecting, so getting these kids or a lot of the aggregate community members from all over our city, the more and more they're interacting with the soil, not only is it helping them in terms of trauma resiliency and eating healthy food, but also increases the aggregate immune system of our city. And that's what we're really keenly interested in, especially around the recent pandemic with COVID, because it's right now we're in a very reactive response to COVID, but I'm hoping what we're doing here in Winston and a lot of other trends that I'm seeing around the US and world is there's a lot of proactive responses on how to build a more resilient immune system, and getting your hands in the soil is the first place to start with that. So.
Wow, cool stuff. Okay, I'm going to go back to Dr. Bhowmik. What role does soil play? And we've touched on this, so you can kind of go into whatever you feel like going into. But what role does soil play in greenhouse gas emission and mitigation? In other words, source and sink. And also, how does regenerative agriculture compare to other climate mitigation solutions? I think you've also touched on this in terms of scale and attractiveness. Sorry.
Yeah, so very quickly, soil can act both as a sink and a source of greenhouse gases. So we need to be very careful not to treat it as dirt, because organic matter decomposition and will yield more carbon dioxide coming out from the soil. And I think the film kind of talks about there's 2 times more carbon in the soil as compared to the total carbon in all the vegetation and the atmosphere. So I think that's a key point. Your second question, attractiveness and scaling. I think that's a very, very important question. I can say that, some of these regenerative or climate smart practices are affordable versus, moving into, electric motors. I mean, that is also another option, but, those are expensive, right? So that's something to consider. And the scaling, I mean, we need to have the scaling from very, small scales to higher scales, because most of the farmers in the United States are small scale farmers. So if we don't really, build their capacity, help them to regenerate their farms, our food production system is going to get affected. So food security is at stake. And then, we have the large scale farmers who have acres and acres of land. And that's very important, because they're controlling a huge amount of, carbon footprint that would come from those soils. So I think scaling up, scaling down, very, very, very important.
Okay, great. So, Steve and Elke, how can consumers, and this could go for everyone, how can consumers support Indigenous farmers and farmers of color, also just small scale farming? Because that's not necessarily what we're getting if we're shopping at the grocery store.
Yeah, shop local farmers market first, and then whatever you don't get there, then you can pick up at, Lidl or Food Lion, something else, but shop there first.
Or you can come directly to our farm and purchase.
I'll expect some biochar if I do that.
Yes.
be great. Okay, how about supporting Indigenous farmers and farmers of color in North Carolina?
That's actually a good question, and I don't have an easy answer for that. But if you're at the farmers market, you could look around for the, farmers of color and shop at their booths first.
And you guys participate in the
Rafi,
Farm to Church?
From the
Right.
church, yes.
That's
Yes.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a program started by Rafi where local churches here in Raleigh, right now there's 10 churches that are participating in the program, collectively have a total of 80 shares for a community supported agriculture, which is split up between 3 different farmers. So we are one of the farmers, and we've got Ken Daniels from Singing Stream Farms in Wake County, and Demetrius and Soul City Farm. And so we are, for the spring CSA, we've committed to delivering 8 weeks of, spring vegetables directly delivered to these churches so that the members that are supporting us there can receive them.
Awesome. That's beautiful. Okay, so a quick one for Kat. What are some of the roadblocks and misconceptions you hear that keep people from composting?
Oof. Okay. So on an individual level, I absolutely think it's 2 main things. One, I think people outside of the land, right? Some people don't want to get into vermicomposting. I have a nightmare story if anybody has time later. But I would say on an individual level, one of the biggest kind of barriers is just not knowing how and thinking it's rocket science. It is science, but it's not rocket science. And it just takes a little bit of time and effort. And also just try. I always say, just try. So I would say, I think that's a big misconception, is that it's a lot harder than what it really is. On the flip side, another kind of misconception is what composting is. And I'm sure people on the panel totally relate to this of folks call CompostNow all the time and say things like, yeah, I threw my apple in the woods, I'm composting. And I always have to say, you're littering, not composting. So it is kind of this interesting idea of what people think composting is. They think it's just breaking food down. That's rotting. And composting requires a lot more. And I'm sure everybody on the panel also, I'm not going to get into it, but even when you think about composting, you have aerobic and anaerobic, and there's even a split there. So I do think on one hand, people think it's a lot harder than what it really is, but it is a little bit more difficult than just throwing it in the woods, right? So where do we find that happy medium of bringing people into the fold, but making sure they're composting correctly? And then on a larger level, because we must talk about this if we're going to relate it to this movie, I think we have a huge shortage of facilities. I mean, in the US, just the Southeast, Brooks and McCalla are one of the only, and Atlas maybe, is the only one in North Carolina really on large scale. So if we're going to have really, 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 really strict and aggressive waste reduction goals by cities and towns, we also must actively be investing and creating policies around making sure that it's easy to get capital to start these facilities. Because if we don't have those facilities, we cannot compost on a large enough level to really have any kind of effect on climate change. Yeah, that's my spiel.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you. So we are quickly running out of time. I didn't notice how close we were getting to the end of our time together. So before we close, I wanted to give each of our panelists a chance to share any thoughts, websites, news, events that you'd like to share, anything you want to share or highlight. We also had a question from Gail that we could toss in here. She wants to know she says 5 things. Let's go with one thing that we can do this week after having watched this film. Anybody can go who wants to go.
Not going to be me this time.
Anybody? Anything you want to share, or just last thoughts you want to leave us with?
I'll share that we are in the process of becoming a fully regenerative farm.
Wow.
So we are in the transition, and we have a goal of 2025 to become fully regenerative. I think that's kind of ambitious, particularly with a 3-month-old right now, and I'm mostly caring for her, and Steve's largely, doing much more of the farming. But it is a transition. So I know there's an idea that this is the answer, the regenerative farm. We should all just like overnight become regenerative. But it is important to know that it takes time to get there. If we wouldn't have the same yields, if we just stuck plants in the ground right now and didn't till, like they wouldn't grow and get the same yields that we get with the tilling process. So there is a transition to becoming no-till, and we're in that process. And one of the takeaways, one thing to do or change or incorporate would be, shop local, shop small farms. I honestly believe small family farms are, what's going to save us in the future, because the large scale agriculture created the problem. They will also solve the problem, but locally, supporting small family farms is where we can begin to take the steps, now, without waiting for big ag to catch up.
Excellent.
I'd like to add to that too. That was beautiful. Thank you for sharing. I would say just like 2 tips for this week, Earth Week. One, on an individual level, use your money to align with your values. So oftentimes we're so tired because capitalism, we just use our money to do anything that's convenient. But our money is power. And so invest it in the systems and the circular economy and that aligns with your values, like small farmers. And then 2, on a higher level, it's not just up to individuals. We must hold the biggest polluters accountable, and we must support progressive policies and lawmakers. So definitely get involved at the higher level as well.
Thank you, Kat.
My 2 cents would be, let's stop treating soil as dirt and give it the respect that it deserves. And second, let's adopt a plant, start, growing as much as possible. Thank you.
Fantastic. Eric?
Yeah, 3 really quick things. One thing is I am a community gardener through and through. You can start in your backyard with just growing some basil, stupid simple. As I said earlier, the best thing that we can do in terms of building up our overall resiliency is getting our hands in the soil. It literally makes you happy. And then starting from there, if there's a local community garden, connecting with that local network and leaning over to the gardeners, you learn so much rich knowledge from that. And 2 other announcements. I can't resist an opportunity for a book plug. I'm releasing a book in about a month called Assembling Restoration. It's in collaboration with a global network called Living Architecture Systems Group. Lee, I can send you a link, and the book should show up there in about a month as an ebook and then released in a paperback. And it talks about a lot of the science that I alluded to and a lot of the other folks, especially biochar and stuff like that. And then last, as discussed before we started this, my research is going deeply into the meditative prayer arena in a very interspiritual way. I mean, we've got folks that I'm working with all the way from, Druids to Buddhists to you name it, the whole gambit. But we're now potentially putting together a panel to start connecting meditation to gardening and some of the actual science of what happens when you put your hands in the soil. There's very, very strong correlations between that. So I want to prompt your listeners to look out for that link. It's going to be in collaboration with the St. Francis Prayer Center, of which I'm happy to say that we're developing a regenerative farm there, as well as a very, very large food forest over the next 4 years as a part of that meditative component. So thank you.
Very exciting. And that's actually where Eric and I met, was at the St. Francis Fair Center. It's very cool. Okay, so we have about 4 minutes left, so let's close it up. On behalf of Towards Zero Waste, I want to thank all of our panelists and you for attending this event tonight. We want to let you know about a few opportunities you may be interested in. Firstly, Kat let us know that audience members can receive 2 free weeks of the CompostNow service and will automatically receive 20 pounds of compost in their compost bank, so that could be delivered later, upon signing up for CompostNow using the link in the chat. Hopefully somebody will stick that in the chat. And then there are a couple of other events you may want to catch on Earth Day tomorrow. North Carolina A&T and its College of Agriculture and Environmental Science will present Environmental Justice, Equity, and Sustainability Earth Day Imperatives. That's tomorrow at noon to 1:30. They have a great panel lined up, which includes our Dr. Bhowmik, and it will be moderated by Tracy Lloyd McCurdy. That's the executive director of the Black Belt Justice Center, a legal and advocacy nonprofit organization dedicated to assisting African-American farmers, landowners, and communities in the Black Belt region. And we will also put that link in the chat. Also tomorrow for Earth Day at 5 p.m., I will be presenting at the virtual Sci-Tech Expo through the North Carolina Museum of Science on moving towards zero waste. If you would like to learn more about our organization or future events, please take a look at our website at towardzerowaste.org. Towards Zero Waste North Carolina is a nonprofit and offers all of our events and education for free. So if you feel inspired to help us with our mission, check out the link and donate in the chat, over in the chat. That's it. Thank you, everyone. I so appreciate everyone for being here, and I really thank our panelists for this discussion. We could have gone on longer, lots more to talk about. Thanks, everybody, and good night.